Welcome back. I hope you have your traveling clothes on because we've got a lot of territory to cover. Last week, we finished our week with attending Sarah's funeral. And we know that before Sarah died, that God had touched her life, touched Abraham's life, and caused them to be able to have a son, Isaac. When Sarah died, she was 127 years old. That would have made Abraham 137 years old. What's amazing about that is we know that at 100 years old, Abraham was no longer able to father children, but God touched his life and we saw him rejuvenated and made virile as a young man again. After Sarah dies, we know that touch of God didn't end with Isaac. We see that after Sarah dies, Abraham is about 137, and so maybe somewhere between 137, 38, 39, who knows exactly how many years it was. But Abraham marries again, and he marries a woman named Keturah. We know really nothing about Keturah other than her name, and the fact that Abraham fathered 6 more sons by Keturah. If we do a bit of digging and research, we find that these 6 sons are represented in the Arab tribes, which is an interesting thought because you look at all the half-brothers of Isaac through the centuries, there has been a continual fight to gain control of the inheritance that God gave to Isaac. We also get ready to say goodbye to Abraham. Abraham dies at 175 years old, which would have made Isaac 75 years old, which is a lovely thought to see how many years Abraham had with his son Isaac. Ishmael was 88 when Abraham died. And as we continue our journey, this is a time it would be good to have a good atlas, because as you look at the descendants of Ishmael, you will find the territories in that on an atlas. So you may want to get an atlas and do some research yourself on these things. We know that Isaac was 37 years old when Sarah died, and he was 40 when he married Rebekah. There are some things that Isaac learned from his father, which we will see in our journey as we go on. We will see that Isaac learned to build an altar whenever there was a significant time in his life. You can be sure he learned that from his father. We will also see that he learned not only good things from his father, but he learned some bad things from his father. For instance, we know that Abraham had his beautiful wife, Sarah, and knew that she had the kind of beauty that men would kill for. Well, we know that Isaac got his wife from the same stock, and sure enough, true to the family form, we know that she was beautiful. Rebekah was beautiful in face and form, and once again had that kind of beauty that men at that time would kill for. And so what does Isaac do? He does the same thing his father does. He lies about his wife. He says, nope, she's not my wife, she's my sister. And we see this in the whole incident with Abimelech, who is the king of the Philistines. But there's something else we can learn from this instance. We know that Abimelech looks out and he sees Isaac with his wife, Rebekah, and he's caressing her. He's kissing her. We learn a bit about the relationship that Isaac had with Rebekah. It was a loving, tender, touchy-feely kind of relationship. And out of that, Abimelech recognizes, hey, this is not this guy's sister. You don't treat your sister that way. And so God spares Rebekah and protects her. But there's another thing we learn. In this life of Rebekah, we find that once again, she's barren. Interesting how that trait carried over. And in this barrenness, obviously she talks to her husband about her barrenness. But the beautiful part of this is what Isaac does, unlike the incident with his father and his mother, where his mother gives his concubine to his father. Isaac doesn't go that route. Apparently he learned from what his father and his mother had done. So what does Isaac do? I love that scripture that says, and Isaac prayed for his wife. Isaac knew where true life comes from, and Isaac knew who to go to. And out of that prayer, God's response was to open Rebekah's womb, and not just open it, but open it with the double portion and give her twins. Now that Jacob and Esau are born, there's so many things that we could stop and ponder and look at, but I want us to go to a couple of those major things, the major monuments. One of them that comes, obviously, as you're journeying on, you'll see it happens quick in the journey, is the whole incident where Jacob buys his brother's birthright. Did you notice I didn't say Jacob steals his brother's birthright? We're going to look at Jacob stealing his brother's blessing in just a few moments, but I want us to understand that Jacob did not steal his brother's birthright. To understand that, we need to understand a birthright. A birthright, the firstborn would always receive double portion of what any other child born after that, any other brother after that would receive. And so with Jacob and Esau, there's two of them. And you would take all that their father owned, all that Isaac owned, and you would divide all that into three portions. And Esau was entitled to two of the portions, while Jacob was only entitled to one. That was the birthright. We also need to understand that in the birthright, the son who was the oldest, who had the birthright, when the father died, not only did he inherit his portion, he inherited the second portion as well. And in that portion was the care of his mother, because a woman didn't have inheritance. She only had inheritance and provision through a son. And so that oldest son would not only get his portion, but he would also have to take care of his mother, and he would have a greater portion because of that. As we look at the information given to us about Jacob and Esau, we begin to understand the dynamics that caused Jacob to do what he did. We know that Esau, he was a hunter. He didn't like to be stuck around the family camp. He liked to move about. He liked to be out in the free air and hunting, where Jacob was that kind of young man that stayed at home. He was there to help his mom. He was there to take care of the camp. He was there to watch over things. He was the caretaker of the homestead. And as we look at Esau had no desire for it. And remember too that Esau was his father's favorite, not his mother's. And when there's that favoritism, a child is well aware of it. And so Esau knew he was the father's favorite, but not the mother's. He also knew that Jacob had the mother's favor. And so when it came to having to take care of his mother, if anything happened to his father, it wasn't as important to him where it was to Jacob. And so Jacob saw that Esau had no care about the homestead. He had really no care about his mother, and Jacob did. And so when Esau comes famished from hunting and just wants to eat, and so Jacob says, okay, I'll give you what you want. I'll feed you if you sell me the birthright. And I'll give you your food, your pot of beans and your bread, if you will sell me your birthright. Bible tells us that Esau despised his birthright. if you look at that word despised, it means he had very little regard, held it with very little value. Genesis 25:34 says it this way. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And so it was Esau's choice to sell that birthright for a pot of beans and a piece of bread. That's how much he despised it. That's how little value he put on it. But that brings us to the next incident, which is quite different. Now we see that Isaac is getting old. He probably has cataracts over his eyes. It says his eyes were dimmed from age. And so he's probably dealing with cataracts at this time. So he doesn't see well, and he tends to be a bit feeble. Matter of fact, a whole lot feeble. And so he says to his son Esau, I don't know how much longer I'm going to live, and I want to make sure I give you this blessing. Now, Rebecca hears this, and we need to look at this not from what we've heard traditionally. We need to look at it in its time and understand it from the culture and the time that they're in. Now, when Rebecca hears her husband talking to Esau, and she knows he's sending Esau out to get the food so that when he comes back, he can bless him. Now, we look at blessing much different than they did back then. We say, well, God bless you. Well, what are we really saying? What are we asking God? What are we invoking God's name to do? And when they blessed back then, that's exactly what they were doing. A blessing was to invoke God to hold fast to the words that are spoken. It's interesting how we look at the word cursing, and we have a tendency to keep the same thinking attached to cursings today, but not to blessings. For instance, we say, this person is having trouble in their life. Maybe it's because a curse was spoken over them. And so we see that a curse can be binding and can affect not only that generation, but generations after. Well, blessings back then were the same way. And so Rebecca knows that her husband favors Esau, and that if Isaac blesses Esau, he is going to bless Esau with the majority of what he has. And so when Rebecca hears this, Rebecca remembers what God has spoken to her when these twins were in her womb. Genesis 25:23 says this, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. God's choice was that Jacob would be the one who would receive the inheritance. Let me read it to you from Romans 9, verses 10 through 12. It says, and not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purposes according to his choice would stand, and not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger. So when Rebecca hears this, she has a choice to make. She knows what Isaac is going to do. And so she comes up with a plan to be certain that Isaac doesn't thwart the word of God or the plan of God. I want you to think about it. I hear people fault Rebecca for what she did, and yet I never, ever in scripture find where she is reprimanded or a negative word is spoken about her decision. If you stop and think, what if Isaac had given that blessing to Esau? Because God has made a choice. And his choice isn't going to change just because man has decided to do something different. God would be certain to make sure his choice stood. So I want you just to think about that, maybe discuss it if you're in a group. What would have happened had Rebecca just stood back and done nothing? Just some food for thought. So she comes up with the plan that she is going to deceive her husband so that the blessing that he's about to speak falls on the one that God intended it to fall on and not on the one that God hadn't chosen. And as you read through and as you consider this deception, what's fascinating about it is you will find that in this deception, all 5 senses are involved. Isaac is deceived by 4 of them. One of them, he's not so sure. So see if you can find it as you're journeying through that portion of your word. See if you can find all 5 of the senses. We know that, sure enough, Isaac gives Jacob this amazing blessing. By the time Esau comes in, he says, well, Father, bless me with something. And basically Isaac has to say, I don't have anything left to bless you with. And yet he digs deep, and we know that Isaac's words to his son Esau did come to pass. But Esau is overwhelmed with anger. And as a result of this turn of events, Esau makes a decision that he's going to kill his brother. That brings us to Jacob's flight from Esau. Rebecca uses her frustration regarding Esau's choice of women, because we know Esau married 2 Canaanite women, and Rebecca uses this opportunity, her frustration with the Canaanite women, to convince Isaac that they need to send their son Jacob away to her brother so that he can find a wife and not take a wife from the Canaanite women. Also interesting at this time, we know that Esau is 40 years old when he marries, and when he sees how disappointed and how unhappy his father is with his choice of women, Esau decides, well, I'll marry again, and this time I'll make my dad really happy. Oh, sure. And so where does he go? He goes to Ishmael, and he marries Ishmael's daughter, Mehalat. I'm not sure that was quite the answer. But in the meantime, Jacob knows he's got to leave, and Jacob leaves to go to his Uncle Laban's. That's no small journey. If you, again, take out a map, look at the atlas, and you'll find that from where he is, where Jacob is in Beersheba, and now having to go up to Haran, you're talking about 400 to 500 miles. And that's a straight shot. If you're thinking in kilometers, that's between 640 to 800 kilometers. That was no short journey. And so he begins the journey. He gets as far as what becomes, it was known then as Luz, it becomes known as Bethel. And in Bethel, we know this is where Jacob's going to spend the night. He has this dream, and in the dream, the heavens open, and there is a ladder that allows the angelic beings to ascend and descend. And when Jacob wakes up, he recognizes he is at the very gate of God, the doorway to heaven. And so Jacob builds an altar there, and he has an encounter, an amazing encounter with God there. And Jacob makes a vow to God. Listen to his vow. Jacob says this: if, notice the word if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then Yahweh, the Lord, will be my God. Do you see the vow? If God will do this, then I will do this. Up till this moment, Jacob knows Yahweh. He knows him as the God of his fathers Abraham and Isaac. But he says, if God will take care of me, keep me safe, and bring me back, then Yahweh will be my God. Hold on to that vow, because we will revisit it again in the not too distant future. And so we see Jacob go to his uncle Laban in Haran, and this is where he meets his beautiful wife, Rachel, who obviously wasn't his wife at the time, but the one that he is going to take for a wife. And then he also meets the not so attractive Leah. We learn about Leah in the days to come. You might want to pay attention to some of the things that Leah says. It says, the Bible tells us, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. We learn a lot about Leah and the kind of person she was, the kind of character she was, and what kind of personality she had. And we find that she was a very controlling, domineering woman. If we kind of wonder how come the oldest one wasn't married first, well, not only was she not so attractive when it came to her physical, but apparently her attitudes weren't so attractive either. And so we see Jacob meet Rachel, falls in love with her head over heels, and Uncle Laban makes a deal. You work for me for 7 years, and this bride is yours. And so it says that it hardly seemed like any time, because he just loved her, loved being around her, just loved her. And 7 years went by quickly for him. But the night of his marriage is not quite the night that he anticipated, and he didn't get the bride of his dreams. You might wonder how it is that Jacob could have been so deceived by Uncle Laban and wake up in the morning with this woman that wasn't the bride of his dreams. Well, you need to understand the marriages at that time. Their marriages were big events that lasted for days, and at some point in the marriage, the man would go take his bride and take her into the tent. But usually that time of taking her and consummating the marriage in the tent was after quite a bit of time of celebration. And so you can be certain that Jacob had a few toasts to his marriage, and that the wine had flowed freely. So by the time he got to the tent at night, it was dark. He was a little tipsy, at least. And so you can put the pieces together and see why in the morning he woke up and said, "Whoa, what are you doing in my bed?" And so I know that it's often taught that he had to work 7 more years, and he didn't get to have Rachel for 7 more years. That's not exactly accurate. And as you're journeying through the pages, read it carefully. Jacob did have to make a contract to work for Rachel for another 7 years, considering the first 7 for the purchase of his wife. But the second 7, he had to work 7 years, but he didn't have to wait 7 years. It says in Genesis 29, 27 through 28, complete the week of this one, meaning Leah, and we will give you the other, meaning Rachel, also for the service which you shall serve with me for another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife. You notice that it says Jacob did so, and he completed her week, and then he got Rachel. So he got Rachel after a week with Leah, and then we see that he had to work for another 7 years. As we continue our journey with Rachel and Leah, we learn a major lesson that we would do well to pay attention. We learn with Rachel. Rachel had the favor and the love. She had a loving relationship with Jacob. What she didn't have is she didn't have fruitfulness. What did that equal in her life? It equaled frustration. As we look at Leah, we find that Leah was fruitful, but she didn't have a loving relationship. What did that equal? It equaled frustration. It was only when love and fruitfulness were combined together that it equaled fulfillment. That brings us to the next portion of territory that we're going to cover, and that's the war between Rachel and Leah. It's the battle for dominance, the battle for inheritance. As I spoke earlier, that a woman only inherited through sons. She didn't inherit on her own. So when we look at Leah's life, we see that God saw that she was unloved, and God opened her womb, and she began to bear children, and she bore Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah. And at that point, she's had 4 sons, and Rachel has had none. And so certainly Leah can see, I have the dominance. I have the inheritance. My sister basically has nothing. That's why Rachel, seeing that she has no security, no inheritance, what does she do? She gives her maid Bilhah to Jacob as a wife. And she says that she may bear children on my knee. In other words, Bilhah would be like a surrogate mother for Rachel. And the children that Bilhah would bear would belong to Rachel, because Bilhah belongs to Rachel. And so through Bilhah, Rachel has 2 children, and now she's halfway caught up to her sister, and her sister looks and says, wait a minute, I'm losing control, I'm losing my grip. So what does Leah do? She gives her maid Zilpah to Jacob for a wife. And so we see this constant battle between them, the battle for inheritance. As Jacob continues to be a success not only with his children and gaining a family, he also becomes a success in the flocks and the herds, and Laban contracts with Jacob and says, okay, let's make a deal. And so Jacob, he says, all right, I'll take all the spotted, speckled, black, whatever. And Laban's constantly changing his wages, because every time he changes his wages, God blesses Jacob. If he says it's just going to be black sheep, all the sheep that are being born are black. And so they get separated out of the herd and taken to Jacob's herd, which obviously his sons would be taking care of his herds. And so then Laban would say, okay, no more black ones, now it's spotted ones. And so he kept changing his wages, because it would be easy to detect which sheep belonged to Jacob. And when they would be born, oops, this is a spotted one, so it goes to Jacob's herd. Oh, this is a striped one, it goes to Jacob's herd. And so Jacob's herd began to grow enormously, and while Laban's is beginning to dwindle, and Laban's jealousy begins to be stirred, and in that jealousy, the unfairness towards Jacob begins to elevate. But one thing I find interesting about that is, as I look at Jacob, in spite of all of this, in spite of how miserable he is and how many times Laban tries to hurt Jacob, Jacob doesn't leave. Jacob doesn't depart Haran until God says, Jacob, it's time to go home. Before we leave this part of our journey, though, I also want to talk just a moment about Jacob taking, and he cut strips into the bark of a branch, and then he would put it where the sheep would mate, or when they would be eating. He would put these sticks that were striped, and these weren't magic sticks. I truly believe what Jacob was doing is when Laban would change his wages, he would say, God, I'm trusting you. And these were rods of declaration of faith. And he would put it wherever the sheep would come and where they would mate. And he was declaring, God will bless me. And God did. But there came that time when God says, it's time to go home, Jacob. And Jacob, after 20 years, not just a few years, after 20 years, he begins to head home. That journey home was quite a journey. Now he gets to Mizpah. Mizpah means watchtower. This is where Laban catches up with Jacob as he's stolen away. And the first thing that Jacob has to do as he's heading home is he has to deal with the problems of his past. He couldn't move on to the future until he dealt with the things of the past. And so here at this place, at the watchtower, at Mizpah, this is where he deals with the contention between he and Laban. And they make a pact between them. I won't come this way to hurt you. You don't come this way to hurt me. And here is this memorial that we're setting up that is the witness of the vow we've just made to each other. As they make that pact, Laban, you'll notice that Laban calls two gods to be a witness. It says that Laban calls the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor. The God of Nahor was not the God of Abraham. And we know that Laban served his father's gods. How do we know that? Because we know that Rachel steals her father's household idol. And so we know that Laban is still worshiping the God of Nahor. And so when they make this pact, he invokes two gods there. He invokes Jacob's God, the God of his fathers, and he invokes the God of Nahor, the God of Laban's fathers. Jacob separates himself from that influence and from the gods of Nahor and the God of Laban, and he separates. And after that separation, the next place he comes to is Mehanim. And in this place, which means two camps, it's in this place that Jacob looks and he sees that there are angels. This camp that he sees across from him, this is not a normal camp. This is a camp of angels. How does Jacob know what angels looks like? Because he saw them when he left home. And now he sees them. When he left home, they were coming and he saw that they were there to be with him on his journey. Now, as he crosses over and he begins to head home, once again, he begins that journey with an encounter of angels, this time as a camp, as a military camp. Ones that are there saying, you're not going home alone, and we are here to fight with you and for you. And so when Jacob leaves, he encounters angels. When he comes home, he encounters angels. That brings us to the next place, Peniel or Penuel. Both names mean the face of God. In this place, this is where Jacob has an encounter. In Genesis 32:24, it says that he encounters a man. Let me read it. It says, then Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. So the question is this just a man? Who is this one that Jacob is wrestling with? Now, Hosea gives us a clearer explanation of who this being is that Jacob wrestles with. In Hosea 12, verses 3 and 4, it says, in the womb, he, Jacob, took his brother by the heel, and in his maturity, he contended with God. Yes, he wrestled with the angel and prevailed. This is a fascinating portion of scripture. And have you ever questioned why? First of all, Jacob recognizes that this being that has come to him is an angelic being. How does he know that? Because Jacob has seen angels. He's seen angels when he left home. He sees a camp of angels. Obviously, the angels dress differently. The angels look different. Jacob knows this is an angel. But when the angel comes, and I question this, this is just food for thought. I wouldn't base doctrine on it, but this is food for thought, and this is my thinking. Could it have been that Jacob saw someone, a being, leave the camp of angels, and come toward him, however long that would have taken? And so Jacob separates his family. He sends them across the stream while he stays there. And could it have been that he saw one of the angels leave the camp coming to him? Now, he doesn't know what this one is coming to him for, but he knows it's an angel. And how did the angel approach him? Obviously, the angel didn't approach him as, "Hi, Jacob, I'm just here to say, good on you, boy, you just keep doing good." No, he came, and Jacob could see that this was going to be some kind of a contest. Why would he want to fight with me? And yet Jacob knows that he is going to have to fight with this angel. And so he fights, not just for a match or two. He fights all through the night. Do you realize how virile and how strong this man Jacob would have had to have been? And so he wrestles with the angel all night, and the angel says, "Let me go." Jacob says, "I'm not letting you go." Why won't he let him go? Because he knows this being is a being from God. He knows it's one who carries the word of God. And he says, "I will not let you go until you speak a blessing over me." Because Jacob understands that blessings are like covenants. Let me read it to you from Genesis 32, 27 through 28. And so the angel says to him, he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with man and have prevailed." What was the blessing that this angelic being spoke over Jacob? What he said is, no longer are you going to be known by the character you had before. No longer are you going to be known as one who usurped your brother. You are going to be known as one who contended with God. And because of that contending with God, until he blessed you, your life is going to be blessed. And so when Jacob left that encounter, he left a different man. He walked a different way. He no longer walked in his own strength and in the virility of his own person. Now he walked in the strength of God. He walked with a limp. You could tell Jacob from across the way. You could say, "Oh, there's Jacob. How do you know that's Jacob?" Look how he walks. He walks differently. He walks as a man who's been touched by God. But you might think, how was that? The fact that he limps now and the fact that he's worn out, haggard. Can you imagine wrestling all night? He would have been absolutely worn out. By the time he crosses over the stream and he gets to his wives on the other side, and he's not far from meeting Esau, he's not the same man that they left on the other side of the stream. He's recuperating, he's limping, he's walking. Why would God do that? I've thought long and hard about that, and I truly believe that God knew how Jacob had to appear to Esau when he met him. As Esau is coming to him, we know that Jacob sent out gift after gift after gift. We know that Esau, when he came to meet Jacob, it says that he came with 400 men. This doesn't sound like a real sweet encounter. Could it be that with each wave of gift that came to Esau, and as he came on the next wave of gifts, and he stops them and says, "What is this? Your brother Jacob has sent this to you as a gift." And then the next group, "Your brother Jacob has sent this to you as a gift." Can't you just see that there is a softening in Esau, that he's receiving his brother's gifts with an awareness that his brother is trying to make peace? And by the time Esau gets to Jacob, he finds a man who is weakened, a man who is limping, a man that perhaps in Esau's eyes even is one to be pitied. But we know that by the time Esau got there, Jacob wasn't standing there in his own strength. Jacob was standing there, a man who had been touched by God in humility. And in that humbleness, he meets his brother. Jacob tells us, when his brother says, "Well, come on, let's take you back." And Jacob says, No. I have children. I have ewes that are nursing their young. We've got small calves and that need to be taken care of. No, we can't rush them. Jacob was concerned for all that he had, from the oldest to the youngest. And so Jacob separates himself from his brother Esau, and his brother Esau goes back to Seir. Once again, you might want to get your map out and see where Jacob goes and where Esau lives. And so we follow Jacob as he begins to go into the land and gets to Sukkoth, and he settles there where his fathers had, Abraham had sojourned. Jacob begins to settle. And we also see him get to Shechem. And when he gets to Shechem, we see him buy a piece of land and pitch his tent there. And also there he builds an altar. God has brought him back into the land. He hasn't yet gotten to Bethel. And we will get to that later on in our next journey. But he gets to Shechem. He buys a piece of land. This is his land. We will keep that name, and we will visit Shechem again later on. And remember that this piece of land is deeded. This is deeded to Jacob. He owns this land. And in Shechem, he builds the altar, El Elohi Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. If you remember, this was the place that God appeared to Abraham, the first place God appeared to Abraham when he entered the land. Oh, so much to learn, so much to see. So I hope you're taking your maps and you're following the journey, and take time as you read through the pages of the book. Stop and consider, what would they have felt? What would they think? What would they do? Why would they do that? This is an exciting journey. I hope you will learn from every place that we visit, and that as you journey on your own, you will see far more than the little bits and pieces that I'm able to point out to you in this part of the journey. So God bless you as you continue on this week. May every day be filled with a new revelation of God.